will, go ahead and open your Bible now to Proverbs chapter 30 and verse 18. We're getting very near the end of the book of Proverbs. Sometimes when I was back about chapter 15, I thought, we never will finish the book of Proverbs, moving along at one or two verses a week. You may know, or some of you may have kept up, this is lesson number 69 or 70 that we've had from the book of Proverbs. But every time I read it, I still get a lot more from it. I don't know about you, but I have enjoyed thoroughly studying the book of Proverbs. And now we're in chapter 30. These are the words of Agur. Agur may be Solomon, may have been among the other wise men, but there's still a lot of value in it. We're going to read verses 18 through 20. 18 through 20. There are three things which are too wonderful for me, yes, four which I do not understand. The way of an eagle in the air, the way of a serpent on a rock, the way of a ship in the midst of the sea, and the way of a man with a virgin. This is the way of an adulterous woman. She eats and wipes her mouth and says, I've done no wickedness. Now, going back now, if we will, for just a moment. Let's see if it's letting me go back. When you look at what Solomon is saying here, and the words that he has used, he said, there are three things, and yes, four. That is a process that Solomon or Agur here will follow. Solomon uses that as well. You can find it also, for instance, in the book of Amos. For three transgressions of the people of Ammon, yea, for four. That was a way they would express something by saying, here's three things, and here's even four. And it's almost like the four corners of the earth, the four winds. It's like looking at it from every perspective. But he said, these things are too wonderful, things which I do not understand. What that indicates is these are difficult. In fact, where I can't fully comprehend all that's involved in this. Well, the four things that he is going to mention here is the way of an eagle, the way of a serpent, the way of a ship, and the way of a man. Now, each of those things have some sort of commonality. There's some common denominator between them. What is that? Look at those four things and see if you can see something common among them. Okay, the way something moves. Okay, that's a real good observation there, because each of these things do not leave a trail behind them. If an eagle passes through the air, how do you know it's passed through the air? You can't see it. Or a serpent that has crawled on a rock. How can you tell where he's crawled? Or a ship that goes through the midst of the sea. After the ship passes by, what do you see? There's no residual left of all of this. Well, when you look at what Solomon is saying here, he is trying to take these things and let me see if I can try to put them together here. He says, the way of a man with a virgin. Now, I know that gets into an area which we don't really want to spend a lot of time discussing, but a man with a virgin, we're not talking about marriage here. We're talking about a man who has his way with a virgin. He ended up raping her. Now, he was smitten with her, is the word we would say. He just couldn't think of anything else, to the point where it was making him sick. Well, if you drop down with me now to verse 15. After he humbled her, after he took away her virginity, then Amnon hated her exceedingly, so he hated her with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he loved her. And Ammon said to her, arise and be gone. Now, how did Ammon treat her? What's that? Very badly. He treated her as if she was an object to be used. He treated her with no respect for her nor her virginity, which was a very precious thing for a person to enter into marriage knowing they were pure and whole, and now he'd taken that away from her. And he acted like after it was over, this is no big deal to me. I'm done with her. She can be arise and be gone. We'll take that now with verse 20. Look and see what you see there. This is the way. What he's doing, he's tying verse 20 with verse 18 and 19. This is the way of an adulterous woman. What does she do? She eats, she wipes her mouth, and then she says, I have done no wickedness. Answer for this. Well, how does a person commit sin and then think there's nothing wrong with it? No conscience? They think, well, I can find some way to justify this. Well, if you go back to chapter 14 and verse 9 of Proverbs, he said, fools mock at sin. That's no big deal. No problem with all of this. I'd suggest to you, if you're studying through this section here, he says there's three things that are too wonderful for me, things which I do not understand. Now it's not the fact that they're incomprehensible, it's the fact that how can people do this? How can people, how do young men humble young women and think there's no big deal to it? And that happens daily here. That's a part of a young, this generation. They've been raised in a society where sexual promiscuity is just considered to be normal. I mean, they see it on television, they see it in society, they see it sometimes in their parents, and they think, this is no big deal. Are there consequences to it? Does it leave a trail? Absolutely it does. And that's why Agar or Solomon would say here, it's too wonderful for me. I can't understand it. Why does it exist? No, I mean, of course, he ended up dying at the hands of Absalom, but it tells you exactly that there are consequences to it. There are fallout from it in all of this. Well, let's go to verses 21 through 23 now. This is another one of his 3 and 4, because he'll say, for 3 things of the earth is perturbed, yes, 4 it cannot bear up. Notice the word perturbed and bear up. Those are parallels to be used there. Then in verse 22, for a servant girl, or for a servant when he reigns, and a fool when he is filled with food, a hateful woman when she's married, and a maidservant who succeeds her mistress. Now, let's look for just a second here. 3 things the earth is perturbed. I don't know if we use that word as much today. My mother used to use that word a lot. I guess it's because of me. But, what does it mean to be perturbed? Annoyed? Anxious? Joe said, irritated, annoyed, and put out. That's pretty good. That's pretty much reflects the idea. The 4, it cannot bear up. What do you mean to bear up something? What's that? Tolerate. You can't stand it. Things that annoy you, things that irritate you, and then you get to the point where you just can't stand it. It's just, something you cannot even bear. Well, that's what he's trying to talk about. And there's 4 things that he's going to talk about here, and they're interesting in let's look at verse 22. For a servant when he reigns. That's an interesting concept there. A servant who becomes the king. Can you think of any servant who became a king? Well, David was, but I'm thinking one, Joseph. I'm thinking one even closer to this situation. Who's Solomon's son? Rehoboam. And what happened to the kingdom when Rehoboam became king? It was split. Who received the northern kingdom? Jeroboam. What was Jeroboam's position prior to getting the kingdom? He was the servant of Solomon. The servant of Solomon. Now, why would it be a difficulty for a servant to become the king and to become one who reigns? Okay, going to their head. How do most of us feel when we're working under somebody? Maybe I shouldn't say all of us feel that way. Have you ever heard people say, my boss is an idiot? Or the older people are out of touch. My parents, they're out of touch. They don't know anything. They look at people and they think right now they know it all, but they don't know it all. They think they know how to make decisions, but they have not been put in that position. You take a person who's a servant and you turn around and put him in charge, what happens? You've got somebody who doesn't know what they're doing. They're just going on the basis of their own perspective. I try to tell people sometimes when I hear them criticize the elders, I say, but do you realize how many people, you may want this, but they may have somebody else over here who wants that, and there may be somebody else who wants something else, and you just only have your perspective. You don't understand. They're looking not at your perspective, they're looking at several people, especially when they're trying to deal with matters of judgment. And so they do the best they can at trying to make the right decision, taking everybody's opinions into account. What time will we have services? If we ask what time will we have services, somebody say, hey, I like it real early in the morning. I like to get up at 7 o'clock. Let's have worship at 7 o'clock. Somebody say, hey, I don't like getting up till about dinner time. Let's have it at noon. Y'all think, and then you've got to say, well, how are you going to make a decision there? Well, somebody would say, I tell you what I'll do. We'll have it at 6:30 in the morning because that's what I want. You take a servant and you put him into a position of reigning. He doesn't have the experience. He doesn't have the knowledge. Let me give you some passages which I think are helpful here. Chapter 19 and verse 10 says, luxury is not fitting for a fool, much less for a servant to rule over princes, because he doesn't know what he's doing. In the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 10 and verse 7, we read, I have seen servants on horses while princes walk on the ground like servants. He said, in other words, there's people who ought to be up here ruling, and they're down on the ground, and there are people who are on the ground sitting up on horses, and they don't belong there. Are there people who should have never been put in a position of power? Yes. And it's because they don't have the right attitude for it. If you take that with verse 21, he said there's three things for which the earth is perturbed, four that it cannot bear up. It's tough to work under a person who does not have the capacity, the knowledge, the understanding, or even the character to be a leader. And so he says, for a servant when he reigns. The second one is a fool when he's filled with food. He's satisfied. What do you mean by a fool who's filled with food? If you're satisfied with something, you're not going to make any changes. If you're satisfied with the car you drive, someone comes along and says, hey, let me sell you a new car. What do you say? I like this one. I don't want another one. Someone comes along and says, hey, I want to tempt you to find you a new wife or find a new husband. You say, I'm sorry, I'm satisfied with the one I've got. I love the one I've got. Satisfied means you don't want to change. Well, a fool who doesn't want to change is a real problem, isn't he? Because he already thinks, hey, everything's fine with me. Let me give you some passages which I think could be helpful here. Proverbs chapter 17 and verse 16 says, why is there in the hand of a fool the purchase price of wisdom, since he has no heart for it? He's got the money to buy wisdom, but he doesn't want it. That's a little bit ridiculous, isn't it? It's like providing a scholarship to a kid to go to college who doesn't want to go to school. What's that going to accomplish? A waste of money. And what he is saying here is, you've got a fool, he's satisfied, he's not ever going to make any improvement. The second passage which is helpful is chapter 26 and verse 8 that says, like one who binds a stone in a sling is he who gives honor for a fool. Now you think about that thought in mind. Binding a stone in a sling. The slings like David used was actually a long piece of either leather or could be some kind of material. And it would have in the middle of it a pocket. And you would sling that around and you'd let one end of that sling go and it would throw the rock out. What happens if you bind the rock inside the sling and then you swing it around? It's not going to go anywhere, but what's it going to do? It's going to hit you, probably in the wrist. He said that's the same way of giving honor to a fool. It's going to come back on you. Is it tough when you got a man who's a fool and he's satisfied with being a fool? And you remember what David said, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. So he really is not going to make any changes. He's satisfied with where he's at. He's not going to make any improvements at all. Verse 23, this is one which is sort of tough. A hateful woman when she's married. Now, don't draw the conclusion that Solomon was anti-women. In fact, if you get to chapter 31, verse 10, he says, who can find a worthy woman? For her price is far above rubies. He talks about he who finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains a favor from the Lord. He is not at all looking at a woman and saying women are bad. But he said there is a kind of woman that is a bad woman. In fact, he's got two different kinds of women in the book of Proverbs that he thinks are bad women. The first one, he says, is hateful. What do you mean hateful? Okay, the opposite of loving. Not caring. Do y'all know what hateful means? You know, full of hate. How does a hateful person act? They're angry all the time. Generally, they act out with words first, do they not? They say things that are full of hate, and then they act out of hate. Well, Solomon here is talking about a woman, and what would you expect out of a woman who's hateful and married? What's that? No love? Bitter? That's a really good observation. Complaining? Selfish? Well, let's look at chapter 19. Let's look at verse 13. 19, verse 13. He said, a foolish son is the ruin of his father, And the contentions of a wife are a continual dropping or dripping. Continual dripping. I don't know if any of you have ever been in a house where there was a faucet leak. Just went drip, drip, drip. You may think it's funny to start with. After about an hour of that, what's going on? Gets on your nerves, drives you up the wall. Now he's saying that a woman that is contentious. Now what does it mean to be contentious? Always arguing. Well, let me give you another verse. Chapter 27 and verse 15. He says there, that was a continual dripping on a very rainy day, and a contentious woman are alike. I really meant to go to chapter 21 and verse 9, where he says, better to dwell in the corner of a housetop than in a house shared with a contentious woman. And then 21 verse 19 says, better to dwell in the wilderness than with a contentious and an angry woman. Contentious and angry. I'm not going to ask any of you men, have you ever made your wife angry and then tried to come into the house and see how many things you've done wrong? But I would say that us men can also be of the same flavor. But he talks about a hateful woman who has been married. Now, who is married. What is that life like? It's miserable. One of the worst things of being a preacher is doing marriage counseling. I mean, I'm honest with you. I'd rather do a funeral any day than to do a marriage counseling. And the reason is because people are people. And usually if they're to the point of asking the preacher to sit down and talk with them, it's because things have already spiraled completely out of control. And usually one or more of the parties is angry and acting hateful. And you've gotten to the point now, how are you going to get things back on track? How are you going to fix things? And but if you take a person who's hateful by nature and you put them in a marriage, it says there's things for which the earth is perturbed and 4 things that it cannot bear up. What ends up happening to marriages where you've got a hateful partner? Divorce, separation. People can't get along, and so they have to live separate and apart from one another. But I will tell you what happens is that hateful person ends up marrying somebody else. Guess what happens to that marriage? Same thing. What's the solution? Quit being hateful. Quit being contentious. Quit being angry. Try to find some way to be a person who is pleasant. Surprising how much things will get better. Then finally is the maidservant who succeeds her mistress. Now, what do you mean by succeeds? Heir to? In other words, the wife is no longer in the picture, whether it's by divorce or death. But now the maidservant becomes the wife. That's just like the servant who reigns. It's just a different perspective of it. And here the mistress feels like she now is in charge. And how's she going to respond? She's going to become a tyrant. And just by the way, can you tell me anybody in the Bible who almost fits this perspective? Hagar. You remember Sarah gave Hagar to Abraham to have a child, and when she had a child, Ishmael, how did Sarah feel about it? She despised her. Genesis chapter 16 and verse 4 says, so he went to Hagar, and she conceived, and when she, that is Sarah, saw that she had conceived, her mistress became despised in her eyes. In other words, the very woman that had served Sarah now is despised in her eyes. So that's some really, really interesting things. Well, let's take the next section here, beginning with verse 24, and we'll read through verse 28. There are 4 things which are little on the earth, but they are exceedingly wise. The ants are a people not strong, yet they prepare their food in summer. The rock badgers are a feeble folk, yet they make their home in the crags. The locusts have no king, yet they all advance by ranks. The spider skillfully grasps with its hands and is in kings' palaces. Now let's go back and let's see what we can see. There are 4 things which are little. Now, you start thinking about little things. Can little things be important? If you don't believe that, stub your little toe walking through the house. How much attention does a stubbed little toe get? The rest of your body is aching because that one little old bitty toe. How much pain can one tooth create? Terrible pain. Little things can have a tremendous impact. And he's talking about 4 little things, and this he's talking about animals. And he says, but just because they're little doesn't mean they're not exceedingly wise. That means they have something in them that is really helpful to understand. Well, let's look at the first one. The ants are a people not strong. What do you mean by an ant's not strong? Teeny tiny. Compared to their size. Now, I will tell you something I have seen. I've seen ants carrying a piece of food bigger than they are. But as far as strength is concerned, how much effort does it take to squish an ant? Take your finger and press on them, or take your foot. They're not strong. But he said they prepare their food in summer. Now, Solomon's already talked about that. If you go back to chapter 6 and you look at verses 6 through 8, he says, go to the ant, you sluggard. Consider her ways and be wise, while having no captain, overseer, or ruler. Provides supplies in the summer and gathers food in the harvest. He's using the same thing. Why do they prepare their food in summer? To last them through the winter. You know, when you think about food, we eat pretty much all the time. But the kind of food he's talking about here is the kind of food that an ant would have to survive through the wintertime. And he says these ants are small, but they're smart enough to realize winter's coming and making preparation for it. And I think what Solomon is trying to say is that you need to look at that and learn. You go back to chapter 10 and you look at verse 5, and he says, he who gathers in summer is a wise son, but he who sleeps during harvest is a son who causes shame. In other words, the use of these animals is to say there's something to learn from them and to learn to make preparation for life. Can you tell me somebody in life who saw that there was going to be a time of plenty and then there would be a time of not much? Joseph. 7 fat years. Let's save up for the 7 lean years. Well, we would be wise if we followed that same sort of principle, is that we recognize that there will be times when things may not be as good, and so when you have, you ought to provide for those times which are not. Let's look at verse 26. The rock badgers are a feeble folk. Now, I want to stop there and talk about rock badgers. Anybody have any clue what a rock badger is? Okay, it's close to a rabbit. In fact, they call them sometimes, rock rabbits. But it's the original Hebrew word here now, they pretty well are certain it means Assyrian hyrax. And somebody says, what is a hyrax? It looks like a large guinea pig, which actually looks a lot like a big rat or a gopher. Actually looks like or not gopher, groundhog. I brought one up on the other day looking at them on the internet where you could see pictures of them, and I thought, we call them groundhogs. But groundhogs live in the ground. These don't. The Syrian hyrax live somewhere else. They live in the crags. Now, what is a crag? It's a hole in the rock, like a little, if you got two rocks lapped over one another and there's a little space in between them, those are called the crags. And it talks about them, they make their home there. And they're described as a feeble folk. What do you mean by feeble? Weak, not a lot of strength, very susceptible to predators, susceptible to weather, but they're smart enough to do what? Go to the crags. They know there's a safe place for them to stay, that the predators can't get them, that the weather can't hurt them. Is there a similarity between this and the ants? The ants provide food. What do the rock badgers provide for themselves? Protection and shelter. Oh, somebody says, I start realizing, there's some necessities of life, food, clothing, and shelter. You start saying, well, these animals are smart enough to find a place to live, a successful place to live. And the wisdom is found in that. Now, next he talks about the locust. And he says, the locust have no king. In other words, there's not a leader among them. Now, if you're talking about bees, what do the bees have? A queen. But locusts have no king. And yet it says they advance in ranks. What does that suggest? They're organized. Now, here's an interesting thing. When you go to the Bible and you start reading about locusts, they're generally a very destructive insect. Psalm 105, verse 34, he spoke and locusts came, young locusts without number. Joel 1 and verse 4 says, what the chewing locust left, the swarming locust has eaten. What the swarming locust left, the crawling locust has eaten. And what the crawling locust left, the consuming locust has eaten. Talking about the different types of locusts. This is the generic word here. But it talks about them that they have no king, and yet they go forth by ranks. They're like an army. They are team players. In other words, have you ever heard we have too many chiefs, not enough Indians? Isn't it great if you can have somebody who is really organized and yet you don't have anybody driving them? What is the small thing about the locust that makes them so powerful? Numbers and the unity of them. In other words, they all go to, like for instance, if we had a locust invasion here, you would have a whole bunch of locusts, but they would all come to the same location and they would all do the same damage in the same area. And but there's not some locust out there saying, okay, I'm the mastermind of this. We're going to go to Bobby Branch Road, or we're going to go to North Chancery Street, or the Old Smithville Highway, or we're going to do this. There's not some king out there telling them where to go and what to do. They all advance in ranks. They work together as a team, and in doing so are really, really effective in that. I think he's trying to say you have to look at yourself and try to work with one another. They don't scatter. Now let's take verse 28. This is interesting. The New King James and the original King James uses the word spider. Some of you other may be looking at different translation, uses the word lizard. The Hebrew word here, along with the Septuagint, the Greek translation, indicates a lizard. So I think the preferable word would be lizard here. In fact, it's more likely to be a gecko kind of lizard. Do y'all know what a gecko is? The gecko sells insurance, Geico insurance. But you've got the picture in your mind. But notice what it says: skillfully grasp with its hands. Some translations say can be grasped skillfully with one's hands. But the idea is that this is, I don't know if you've seen lizards much, but a lizard can run straight up a wall. And not only that, they can turn around and run across the ceiling. Is that not amazing? Of course, spiders can do that as well. So whether you choose either one, the principle will be exactly the same. But then he says they are in king's palaces. What does that mean? They're everywhere. They may be small, but they can go places you can't go. They have an ability to go and climb and scurry about and get through a hole. I don't know about you, but if you ever found a lizard in your house and you say, the first question is, how are they getting in? And does it take much of a space for a lizard to get in the house? No, you can say, are they crawling under the baseboards? How are they getting in the house? Well, here they are in king's palaces. Now, the indication is while this may be small, it can find itself even in the most difficult places to get into. If you take the most secure facility that's in the world, maybe Fort Knox, or perhaps one of the nuclear facilities, are there spiders and lizards there? I have no doubt that there are. So his point is there's these four things that may be as small, but there's something you can learn from them, and you ought to listen to them. Okay, verses 29 through 31. We'll try to get this quickly here. There are three things which are majestic in pace, yes, four which are stately in walk. A lion which is mighty among the beasts and does not turn away from any. A greyhound, a male goat also, and a king whose troops are with him. Now, we'll talk real quickly about this. They are majestic in pace, stately in walk. What does that tell you? Command authority. It's really self-confident. They are confident in who they are and where they are. And the first one that he uses is a lion, which is mighty among the beasts. What do we call the lion? King of the jungle. I think there's a VBS song about that too. There's so many passages. Micah 5, verse 8, 1 Kings 13, 34. I'm not going to go through all of those passages. You already know the fact that if you see a lion and he comes walking up, is he afraid of anybody? No, not at all. Now, the second one is the word greyhound. And when I think of greyhounds, I think of those skinny little dogs that run in races. But what's interesting is the Hebrew word is the word for masculine. And it's often translated girt, like you girt up the loins. Like a man would take his robe, reach through his legs, pull it up, and girt it around. The Bible talks about the girding. And that's the word that's used here. There's some, like the Greek translation, the Old Testament, which was done in the 2nd century BC, uses the word rooster or cock. And so some translations will translate it here of a strutting rooster. Now, how does a rooster walk in the chicken pen? He rules. In his domain, he's the king of the chicken pen, just like the lion is the king of the jungle. And he's got his walk about him. What about a male goat? Okay. Generally, the male goat will have what? Horns. And he's not afraid because if somebody gets in his way. You know what goats will often do with one another? Headbutts. In other words, they feel like they can do that. And the last is a king whose troops are with him. As long as his troops are with him, how does he going to act? Like I'm the king of the battlefield. What happens if the king's army's not with him? He loses his confidence. And so in all of these four things, he's talking about things that are stately in their walk. Now, among all of this, there's a lesson. Well, I'm out of time for today. We'll pick up with verse 32 next week, and then hopefully we'll be able to move on into chapter 31.